You're no longer here.
The billionaire had said 3 years ago, and her life had collapsed in a single day. But tonight, she stood in his mansion wearing an evening gown worth $10,000. But let's start from the beginning. You know, sometimes a single joke can change your entire life. Not a silly line at a party, but the kind of words that slip out when you've stopped believing in anything except the numbers on a screen. That kind of joke changed the fate of 2 people on a cold November night in New York City. Richard Bennett sat in the Imperial restaurant, staring at his tablet as if he could burn a hole through it. 38 years old, billionaire, owner of Bennett Capital, yet he felt like a complete fool. His company had just lost $12 million on a deal that was supposed to be bulletproof. His partners turned out to be scammers, his lawyers shrugged, and he was left alone with the losses and a bitter taste of failure. "Another whiskey?" the waitress asked quietly. Richard lifted his eyes. In front of him stood a woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled into a neat bun, eyes the color of a rainy New York sky. Her name tag read Emily. "Whiskey won't help," he muttered, tapping the screen with his finger. "This won't be fixed by any amount of alcohol." Emily glanced at the tablet. Stock quotes flashed across the screen, red arrows pointing down, numbers dripping loss. "Maybe you could tell me," Richard said with a faint, tired smirk, not even sure why he was still talking, "where should I invest $50 million so I don't completely crash?" He expected her to smile awkwardly and walk away. Instead, she froze for a moment, her gaze sharpening, focused. "If you're serious," her voice suddenly changed, calm, confident, "it's a risky time for tech companies, but gas tech is undervalued due to temporary supply issues. Volatility is high, but if you hedge with options and enter now, while everyone's panicking, you can gain 20 to 30% within 6 months. Also, take a look at pharma, there are some underpriced assets after the latest regulatory news." Richard froze, glass in hand. The waitress had just given him an analysis only an experienced financial professional could produce. She didn't just throw around company names, she spoke of volatility, hedging, entry strategies. "Are you an economist?" he asked, struggling to gather his thoughts. Emily blinked, as if waking up, her expression returning to neutral. "I just read the news," she said, taking his empty glass. "Anything else for you?" "Wait," Richard grabbed her hand, then immediately let go. "Sorry. Do you really think so? About gas tech? I'm a waitress. What could I possibly know?" she replied, stepping back. "Have a good evening." She walked away, leaving him staring at nothing, full of questions. "But before we go on, tell us where you're watching from, we'd love to know how far our stories travel." The next day, Richard did something he had never done before, he took a stranger's advice. He invested a small amount in gas tech, exactly as she had described, hedging through options. His managing director, Mark Collins, called him crazy, but Richard stood firm. A week later, the stock began to rise, exactly as the waitress from the Imperial had predicted. On Friday evening, Richard returned to the restaurant. He specifically asked for a table in Emily's section. She approached with a polite smile, showing no sign of recognition. "Good evening. What would you like to order?" For starters, an explanation, Richard leaned back in his chair. How can a waitress know so much about investments? "I'm not sure what you mean," Emily kept her calm tone, though he noticed her fingers tremble slightly on the notepad. "Gas tech rose 23% this week. You were right. And I want to know, who are you really?" The pause stretched. Somewhere, soft jazz played. Waiters moved quietly between tables. They stared at each other like 2 chess players before the first move. "I'm someone who no longer works in that field," Emily finally said. "And I have my reasons to stay away from it." "What reasons?" "Personal." She turned to leave. $1,000, Richard said sharply. "For a 1-hour consultation. Tomorrow, in my office." Emily stopped, not turning around. "I'm not for sale." $2,000. Just to talk. About the market. About strategy. Nothing personal. You don't understand. $5,000, Richard stood, stepping closer. "And I promise, no questions about your past. Only business. Only finance." She turned slowly. In her eyes was a silent struggle, between the fear of returning to the world she'd lost and the hunger to breathe that world again. "1 consultation," she whispered. That's all. But they both knew it wouldn't be just one consultation. Because when two intelligent people meet at the right time and in the right place, it's impossible to stop at just one. It's like the first crack in ice, small, barely visible, but irreversible. Richard handed her a business card. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. 5th Avenue, Midtown Manhattan. 10th floor. Emily took the card, studying it for a long moment. He noticed something flicker in her eyes. Nostalgia? Pain? Hope? I'll come, she said quietly. But after that, you'll leave me alone. I promise, Richard lied, and they both knew it. As he left the restaurant, Emily stood by the window, watching him go. Her hands trembled. She had been hiding for 3 years, working as a waitress, never once saying words like hedging, options, or volatility out loud. And now, one man and one careless question had shattered every wall she had built in just 5 minutes. This is a mistake, she thought, gripping the business card. A huge mistake. But the next day, exactly at 2 o'clock, she stood in front of a tall glass building on 5th Avenue, wearing the only business suit she had kept from her past life, and pressed the intercom button. And you know what? Sometimes the biggest mistakes turn out to be the only right decisions. But more on that later. For now, I'll tell you honestly, what happens next will keep you glued to the screen until the very end. Because this story isn't just about money or intrigue. It's about how one person can help another regain what was stolen from them. And it's not about money. The Bennett Capital office occupied the entire 10th floor, and it looked exactly like the kind of place where $50 million was a daily operating figure, not a lifetime dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, minimalist design, furniture that whispered wealth without flaunting it. Emily stepped inside and froze for a second. She hadn't been in a place like this for 3 years. 3 years of avoiding high-rises, tailored suits, the smell of expensive coffee, and the quiet hum of printers signing contracts worth millions. Emily Moore, the receptionist smiled. Mr. Bennett is expecting you. His office is at the end of the hallway. She walked down that hallway, and waves of the past hit her. 3 years ago, she had walked hallways like this every day, confident, successful, with a future that seemed unbreakable. Until one day, it all collapsed. Richard greeted her standing. No jacket, sleeves rolled up, he looked younger than he had in the restaurant, sharper, more focused. His gaze was studying her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a chess player studies the board. I'm glad you came, he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. Coffee? Tea? Let's get straight to business. Emily sat down, back straight, hands on her knees. You wanted a consultation, I'm here. 1 hour. Direct. I like that. Richard sat opposite her and placed a folder on the table. Northern Alliance Investments, medical equipment manufacturer. I want to buy a controlling stake, 42%. Price, $18 million. Is it worth it? Emily opened the folder. Her fingers instinctively flipped through the financial reports, audit notes, and forecasts. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and Richard saw something come alive in her, like a plant that hadn't been watered in years finally touching rain again. The statements look clean at first glance, she murmured, diving into the figures. Revenue growth is steady, debt load manageable, but wait. She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Richard stayed silent, watching. 15 minutes passed. Here, Emily pointed at a line. Accounts receivable grew 30% last quarter, while accounts payable dropped. That means they're paying their debts but not receiving money from clients. Cash flow gap. 3 or 4 more months, and they won't be able to cover their obligations. She looked up, and their eyes met. They're hiding it by shifting numbers between categories. But if you dig deeper, you'll see it, the company's on the verge of bankruptcy. $18 million, gone in 6 months. A year, if you're lucky. Silence. Richard stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. In 15 minutes you found what 3 of my analysts missed in 2 weeks, he said slowly. They were looking in the wrong place. Emily closed the folder. Everyone focuses on profit and debt. But the truth is always in the details, in the movement of money, in how fast a company gets paid. Time's up. She stood, and Richard stood as well. Wait, he took out an envelope and handed it to her. 5,000, as agreed. But I have another proposal. No. You haven't heard it yet. It doesn't matter. Emily took the envelope but didn't open it. I'm not going back to that world. I had my reasons to leave, and they haven't gone away. $200,000, Richard said firmly. Per month. Senior analyst position. Full confidentiality, no one digs into your past. Work remotely if you want. You just analyze deals and give me your insights. Emily froze by the door. $200,000. That kind of money could change everything, could give her freedom, safety, and a way to stop hiding. Why? She asked softly. You don't even know me. Because in 15 minutes you saved me from losing $18 million, Richard said, stepping closer. And because I can see it, you're not just good at this. You were born for it. Why hide that kind of talent? I have a complicated past, she repeated quietly. A very complicated one. Everyone does, Richard shrugged. So do I. 2 years ago, my business partner betrayed me, stole clients' money, and fled overseas. I spent 6 months paying for his mistakes. Lost my reputation, friends, almost lost the company. But I survived. And you know what? Now I don't trust anyone, except numbers. And you understand numbers better than anyone I've ever met. Emily stood there, a war raging in her mind. Return to the world she once loved, the one that destroyed her life? Risk it all again? A trial period, she finally said. 3 months. I work under the name Emily Moore. No background checks. No questions. If that doesn't work for you, I walk away, and you forget about me. Deal? Richard extended his hand. She looked at that hand, firm, confident, the hand of a man used to getting what he wants. And she shook it. Then I'll see you on Monday, Emily said, leaving before he could add anything else. Richard stayed by the window, staring out at the city skyline. Mark Collins, his managing director, walked in holding a stack of folders. So that's her? The waitress? Mark asked skeptically. That's her, Richard smirked. And she just saved us from a disastrous deal. Richard, are you sure about this? You know nothing about her. I know enough. Richard turned toward him. She's a genius. And geniuses are rare. I'm not letting her go. Mark shook his head but said nothing. He had a bad feeling about it. A very bad one. By Monday morning, Emily arrived at 9 sharp. She was given her own office, small, but with a window overlooking the city. A computer, 2 monitors, full access to financial databases. A paradise for any analyst. That first week, she worked like someone possessed, analyzing deals, checking counterparties, building financial models. Richard brought her new challenges, and she solved them with such speed and precision that even skeptical Mark began to respect her. How do you know all this? He asked one day, leaning into her office. Emily looked up from the screen. I read a lot, she said simply. You can't learn this from books. Mark sat across from her. You've got real experience. Serious experience. I have a trial contract, Emily replied calmly. And there's no clause about casual conversations. Mark chuckled and left. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, Emily was blossoming. For the first time in 3 years, she felt alive. Numbers, graphs, analysis, that was her native language, her element. She skipped lunches, stayed late, and Richard often found her still working at 8 in the evening. Emily, don't you have a home? He asked one night, bringing her coffee. Home is boring, she smiled faintly, taking the cup. Their fingers brushed for just a second. Here, it's interesting. What is it about finance that fascinates you so much? Richard sat on the edge of her desk. She looked out the window at the evening lights of New York. You know what I love? She said softly. Numbers don't lie. People do, they pretend, they wear masks. But numbers always tell the truth. If you know how to read them, they'll reveal everything, who's truly successful, who's bluffing, who's doomed to fail. Numbers are honest. People aren't. There was such bitterness in her voice that Richard instantly knew, those words carried pain. Someone betrayed you? He asked carefully. Emily turned sharply. Our agreement, no personal questions. Sorry, Richard raised his hands in surrender. It's just. I recognize that kind of pain. I've been betrayed too. By someone I trusted more than myself. Silence. Emily looked at him, and something in her gaze softened. Then you understand, she said quietly. Why I trust numbers more than people. I do, Richard nodded. But you know what I've learned? You can't live only by numbers. Sooner or later, you'll have to trust someone again. Or not. Emily turned back to her computer. Good night, Richard. He left, but his words stayed in her mind. Trust. Easy to say. Hard to do when someone has already broken you once. A month passed. Emily had become indispensable. She had prevented 3 bad deals, found 2 undervalued companies that turned out profitable, and built a new risk management strategy. Richard realized he'd found more than just a brilliant analyst, he'd found a gem. And he also realized something else. He was starting to feel more than admiration. Something deeper. He caught himself waiting for her to arrive, lingering at the office when she stayed late, finding excuses to stop by her desk, just to see her. And Emily? She tried to keep her distance. But one evening, as they were reviewing another deal together over coffee, their eyes met, and that silence appeared, the kind that speaks louder than words. Emily, Richard began. Don't, she said quickly, standing up. Please. Why? He rose too. Because I can't, her voice trembled with pleading. You don't understand. If you only knew. Then tell me. Richard stepped closer. Who are you really? What happened in your past? I can't. Emily grabbed her bag. I have to go. She nearly ran out of the office, leaving Richard standing there, with 1,000 questions and no answers. And the next day, everything changed. Mark Collins was a meticulous man. 50 years in business had taught him one simple rule: if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And Emily Moore seemed exactly that, too smart, too talented, too mysterious. He started small. He ran her background in several databases. Emily Moore, 32 years old, New York City address, worked as a waitress for the past 3 years. Before that, nothing. No education records, no employment history, no trace at all. As if she had simply appeared out of thin air 3 years ago. That was alarming. Mark dug deeper. He began searching through old financial magazines and reports on high-profile cases from the past few years. And then he found it, an article from 3 years ago. Scandal in North Capital Group, top analyst accused of insider trading. A photo. A woman in a business suit, loose hair, confident gaze. Grace Mitchell. Mark stared at the picture, and a chill ran down his spine. The same eyes. The same curve of her lips. The same cheekbones. He opened Emily's employee file, pulled out a copy of her ID, and compared it to the photo on his screen. Different hair color, bangs, glasses on the ID photo, but the features matched. Perfectly. Damn, Mark muttered. He read the entire article. Grace Mitchell, 32, one of the best financial analysts in New York. Accused of using insider information during the purchase of MedPharma Plus stock. The deal brought her $2 million in profit in just 3 days. The evidence, airtight. Witnesses claimed she had access to confidential merger information. The case was ready for court, but Grace disappeared the day before the first hearing. Mark leaned back in his chair. So their brilliant Emily was a fugitive. A fraud hiding from justice. And Richard had brought her into his company, given her access to confidential files and client accounts. He grabbed the folder and went straight to Richard's office. It was nearly 8 in the evening, but Richard was still there. Richard, we need to talk, Mark said, closing the door behind him. What happened? Richard looked up from his documents. Emily Moore. Mark dropped the folder on the desk. Or should I say, Grace Mitchell, that's who she really is. He spread out the printed articles and photos. Richard read silently, his face hardening with each line. Insider trading, Mark said sharply. $2 million in illegal profit. She's been hiding from trial for 3 years. Do you understand what this means? We hired a criminal. We gave her access to all our financial data. Wait, Richard raised his hand. Maybe it's a mistake? Look at the photos, Mark pointed at his tablet screen. It's her. 100%. Richard stared at the image of Grace Mitchell, young, confident, successful, speaking at an investment conference. And yes, it was Emily. Without a doubt. Damn it, he muttered, running a hand over his face. Damn it, damn it, damn it. We have to fire her, Mark said. Immediately. And preferably notify the authorities. No, Richard said sharply. Leave the police out of this. Richard, she's a criminal. She told me she had a complicated past. Richard began pacing the office. She warned me. And you think that excuses it? Mark was furious. She lied to you for 2 months. Worked under a false identity. Do you realize the risk she's created for the company? Let me talk to her first. Richard grabbed his phone. Before we decide anything, I want to hear her side. Her side of what? Mark snapped. Her version of how she stole $2 million. Her version of the truth, Richard said quietly, dialing her number. She answered after the 3rd ring. Hello? Come to the office. His voice was cold. Now. What happened? Come to the office, Grace. A long, heavy pause. You know, her voice trembled. Come. You have 30 minutes. He hung up. Mark watched him with concern. Richard, don't do something stupid. Don't let her manipulate you. You can't trust people like her. I just want to hear the truth, Richard said, sitting back down at his desk. It's the least I can do. For her? Or for yourself? Mark narrowed his eyes. You've fallen for her. Don't be ridiculous. I see how you look at her. Mark shook his head. 2 weeks ago, I almost said something, but you looked happier than I've seen you in years. Richard, she's using you. Then I'll find out. Richard opened the folder with Grace's case. For now, leave us alone. Mark wanted to argue, but one look at his boss's face told him it was useless. He left, closing the door behind him. Richard sat, rereading the articles. Grace Mitchell. A brilliant career, then a sudden fall. Accusations. Scandal. Disappearance. But something didn't add up. If she had stolen $2 million, why work as a waitress? Why hide in New York instead of vanishing abroad? And most of all, the woman he'd come to know over the past 2 months wasn't greedy or dishonest. Quite the opposite, she'd turned down bonuses he offered, saying her salary was enough. 20 minutes later, Grace, walked into his office. She was pale, her hands trembling, but her chin held high. So you found out, she said quietly. Sit down. Richard gestured toward the chair. She sat. Between them lay a gulf, his desk, the weight of mistrust, the shadow of lies. Why? He asked. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Because no one believes the truth. Grace clasped her hands together. All they see are headlines. Accusations. Then tell me your side. Richard leaned back. Right now. This is your only chance. Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I worked at North Capital Group, she began. I was one of their top analysts. I was assigned to evaluate a deal, the merger involving MedPharma Plus. Big transaction, all confidential. She opened her eyes and met his. I did my job. I gave my analysis. The deal went through. And then I found out someone had bought a large block of MedPharma shares 3 days before the merger was announced, making $2 million in insider profit. And that someone was you, Richard said. No, she straightened up. It was Ethan Ross, the son of the owner of Ross Group. He worked at the firm too, had access to the same information. But he bought the shares through shell accounts. Richard said nothing, listening. Then the police came for me. Grace's voice shook. They said the trades were made from my account. They had witnesses claiming they saw me initiate the transfer. Documents, signatures, everything lined up. It was a perfect setup. You're saying you were framed? Richard leaned forward. Do you have proof? No, Grace lowered her head. Nothing. The Ross family is powerful, they have connections everywhere, the police, the courts, the media. My lawyer told me I had no chance. That I'd get 5 to 7 years in prison. So you ran? Yes, she looked up at him. I ran. The day before the trial. Changed my name, my appearance, disappeared. For 3 years I've been hiding, afraid of every knock at the door. And you know what? I don't regret it. Prison would have broken me. At least this way, I survived. Silence. Richard studied her face, trying to decide, was she telling the truth or manipulating him again? Why did you agree to work for me? He asked finally. That was a risk. Because I missed it, Grace admitted softly. The numbers. The analysis. The work. For 3 years I lived like a ghost. Working for you, it was the first time I felt alive again. Richard walked to the window. Do you realize the position you've put me in? If the authorities find out I've been harboring a fugitive, I could lose my license. The company could be destroyed. I know, Grace said, standing as well. And I'll leave. Right now. You'll never see me again. She turned to go, but Richard's voice stopped her. Wait. Grace froze, not looking back. Are you truly innocent? He asked quietly. Look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Did you steal that money? She turned around. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice was steady. No. I didn't steal anything. I swear on everything I have, I'm not guilty. They stared at each other. And Richard saw no lie in her eyes, only pain, despair, but not guilt. Get out, he said quietly. And don't come back. Grace nodded, wiping her tears. Thank you, she whispered. For these 2 months. I was happy. She walked out. Richard heard the door close, her footsteps fading down the hallway. He was left alone in his office, with a folder full of accusations and a heart screaming that he'd just made a terrible mistake. The next 3 days were hell. Richard tried to work but couldn't focus. Every report Grace had written stared back at him, her handwriting, her logic, her brilliance. Passing by her now empty office felt like a stab to the chest. Mark Collins seemed relieved when he heard that Emily, Grace, had been fired. But even he noticed that Richard wasn't himself. You did the right thing, Mark said during lunch on Thursday. She was dangerous for the business. Yeah, Richard murmured, staring into his plate. Richard, forget about her, Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll find another analyst. Someone clean. Someone safe. But Richard couldn't forget. Grace's words echoed in his head, the Ross family framed me. The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. By Friday evening, he couldn't take it anymore. He opened every article about Grace Mitchell's case and began reading them, not as an angry employer, but as an analyst. And then he started noticing the inconsistencies. The case was too perfect. Too perfect. Every piece of evidence pointed at Grace, yet there wasn't a single thread leading anywhere else. The witnesses appeared out of nowhere, the documents were flawless, unnaturally so. Richard had spent long enough in the world of high finance to know, when something looks perfectly clean, it usually means someone worked very hard to make it that way. He dug deeper. He found the name of the investigator who handled the case, Detective Igor Semenov. After half an hour of searching, Richard discovered something interesting. 1 month before Grace's case, Semenov had purchased an apartment in downtown New York worth $1.5 million, on a salary of $3,000 a month. Richard leaned back in his chair. The detective had been bought. Which meant someone had wanted Grace convicted, badly. He started looking into Ethan Ross. Dozens of mentions appeared, social events, business articles, glowing profiles of the Ross Group, an investment empire with $3 billion in assets. The family had friends in government, the courts, the media. If the Ross family had truly framed Grace, they had all the resources to do it flawlessly. Richard grabbed his phone and called a private investigator he'd worked with before. Sam, I need information, he said as soon as the man answered. Ethan Ross. Everything you can find, especially financial transactions from 3 years ago. Bennett, the Ross family isn't to be messed with, Sam whistled. You sure you want to dig into them? I'm sure. How long will it take? A week. Maybe 2. It won't be cheap. Money's not a problem, Richard said, glancing at Grace's photo on his screen. Just find me the truth. He hung up and sat alone in the dark, realizing he had just crossed a line. He was about to investigate one of the most powerful families in the country, for a woman who might still be lying to him. But something inside him, the same intuition that had never failed him in business, told him Grace was telling the truth. A week later, Sam delivered the report. Richard read it until 4 in the morning, and with every page, the picture became clearer. 3 years earlier, Ethan Ross had indeed purchased a large block of Medpharma Plus stock through a shell company registered in Liechtenstein. 3 days after the purchase, the merger was announced, the stock price skyrocketed, and he made $2 million in profit. The money was then transferred to Swiss accounts. 2 weeks later, the police opened an investigation. But not against Ethan, against Grace. Richard printed out the documents and placed them in a folder. He didn't have all the proof, but he had enough to know the truth: Grace had been framed. Methodically. Professionally. Mercilessly. And he was the one who had thrown her out. He grabbed his jacket and car keys. It was 5 in the morning, and dawn was just breaking outside, but he didn't care. He remembered the address she had listed in her employee file, a small rented apartment in Queens. The drive took 20 minutes. Richard parked near an old building, climbed to the 5th floor, and rang the doorbell of apartment 42. No answer. He rang again. Silence. Damn it, he muttered, pulling out his phone. Grace's number was disconnected. Richard went downstairs and found the building attendant. "Excuse me," he said, "apartment 42, the woman who lived there, Emily." "Oh, her," the attendant nodded. "Moved out 3 days ago. Said she was leaving the city." Richard's heart sank. "She didn't say where she was going?" "No," the attendant replied. "She paid a month ahead so there'd be no issues and left with just one suitcase." Richard returned to his car, sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine. She was gone. Again. Just like 3 years ago, only this time, because of him. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel. "Idiot," he hissed. "Idiot, idiot, idiot." But Grace hadn't left the city. She had simply gone back to where it all began, the Imperial Restaurant. The manager, who remembered her as a reliable worker, rehired her without question. And so, once again, she stood there with a tray in her hands, taking orders, smiling at customers, hiding her pain behind a mask of professionalism. The circle had come full. Only now, it was worse, because those 2 months at Bennett Capital had shown her what she had lost. They had shown her what her life could have been, and taken it away all over again. On Saturday evening, she was serving a table by the window when she heard a familiar voice. "Emily." She turned. Richard stood at the entrance, in jeans and a jacket, without his usual polished look. He looked tired, disheveled, and determined. "What are you doing here?" Grace instinctively stepped back. "I've been looking for you for 3 days, he said, walking closer. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she tried to walk past him, but he blocked her path. "Grace, please," his voice was pleading. "Give me 5 minutes." "My name's Emily here," she hissed. "And I'm working. Then after your shift. I'll wait." She wanted to refuse. To tell him to leave her alone. But something in his eyes made her nod. "Fine. 11 o'clock. Richard waited in his car across from the restaurant for 2 hours. When Grace finally came out, he approached her. "I did some digging," he said without preamble. "About Ethan Ross, the MedPharma deal, and the detective who handled your case." Grace froze. "And?" she asked softly. "And you were telling the truth." Richard pulled a folder from the car and handed it to her. "Ethan bought the shares through a shell company. Made $2 million. And the detective who accused you, he bought an apartment for $1.5 million a month after the case closed. On a salary of $3,000. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the folder. She read the papers, tears rolling down her cheeks. You checked?" She looked up at him. "Yes," Richard stepped closer. "And I'm an idiot for not believing you right away. Forgive me. Please." "Why?" she whispered, wiping her tears. "Why did you do it?" "Because I couldn't live knowing I threw you out," he said, taking her hands. "Because those 2 months with you were the best I've had in years. And because I'm in love with you, Grace. Or Emily. I don't care what your name is. I love you." She stared at him, stunned. "You, what?" "I love you," Richard repeated. "And I want to help you take your life back. To prove your innocence. To put those Ross bastards behind bars where they belong." "You don't understand," Grace shook her head. "They're too powerful. They have connections everywhere." "I have connections too," Richard said firmly, tightening his grip on her hands. "And money. And most importantly, we have the truth. Grace, we can do this. Together. But I need your yes. Are you ready to fight?" She was silent for a long time. So long that Richard began to lose hope. Then she slowly nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'm ready." And for the first time in 3 years, Grace Mitchell felt she had a chance, not to run, but to fight for justice. They met the next day at Richard's rented apartment on the Upper East Side, neutral ground, where no one knew either of them. Grace arrived with a backpack containing every document she'd managed to save before she disappeared 3 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "Show me everything," Richard said, spreading a large sheet of paper on the table, grabbing pens and sticky notes. He was in full work mode, focused, methodical. Grace emptied her bag. Bank statements, copies of documents, transcripts of calls she had managed to record before everything fell apart. "Here," she pointed at a statement. "This is my account. See the date? April 23, 2022. Allegedly, I bought MedPharma stock for $2 million that day. Richard studied the document. But you're saying you didn't make that transaction? I didn't, Grace said, pulling out another document. Because that day, I was on a business trip. In Moscow. Here's the plane ticket, here's the hotel receipt. I couldn't have been sitting at a computer in St. Petersburg executing that trade. Then how did they use your account? They hacked it, Grace clenched her fists. Or got my passwords. Ethan had access to our internal system, he could have learned my codes and entered my account. Richard was taking notes, drawing a diagram on the paper, arrows, names, dates. Okay, what next? Who else worked on the deal besides you? Me, Ethan Ross, and another analyst, Michael Harris, Grace said thoughtfully. Michael was my friend. The only one who believed me back then. But he couldn't help. They fired him a week after the scandal. Where is he now? I don't know, Grace admitted. I haven't spoken to anyone for 3 years. I was afraid of getting people into trouble. We need to find him, Richard said, grabbing his phone. If he worked on the same deal, he might have something we don't. An hour later, the private investigator, Sam Peterson, sent an address. Michael Harris, 45, worked as an independent financial consultant. His office was in downtown New York. The next day, they went to see him together. Grace was nervous, she hadn't seen Michael in 3 years. She didn't know how he'd react, whether he blamed her for disappearing. The office was small, on the 3rd floor of an old brick building on Park Avenue. They climbed the creaky stairs and knocked on a door labeled M. Harris, Financial Consultant. It's open, a voice called from inside. They entered. Behind a desk piled with papers sat a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes behind glasses. When he looked up and saw Grace, he froze. Grace, he whispered. My God. Grace, is that really you? Hi, Mike, Grace's voice trembled. Michael stood abruptly, circled the desk, and hugged her tightly. I thought you'd left the country, he said, stepping back to look at her. 3 years, not a word. I was worried sick. I'm sorry, Grace wiped away a tear. I couldn't. I was afraid to put you in danger. In danger? Michael gave a sad smile. They fired me a week after you disappeared. Said I was your accomplice. I had to start from scratch. I'm so sorry. Don't be, he shook his head. I always knew you were innocent. Always. I just couldn't prove it. Richard, who'd been standing by the door, cleared his throat. Sorry to interrupt. Richard Bennett, he said, extending a hand. Bennett? As in Bennett Capital? Michael shook it. Yes. And I want to help Grace clear her name. We need your help. They sat down. Richard laid the documents out on the desk and explained what he had uncovered about Ethan Ross, the bribe detective, and the shell companies. Michael listened, his face darkening. I knew something was wrong, he said when Richard finished. Everything happened too fast. In just 3 days, they accused Grace, gathered evidence, and set a court date. Do you still have any records from that deal? Richard asked. I kept copies. Michael stood, walked to the corner, and opened a safe. Just in case. I thought maybe someday they'd matter. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the desk. Here. All the documents from the MedPharma deal, correspondence, calculations, reports. Grace opened the folder and began flipping through it. Suddenly she froze. Mike, she said slowly. This is an email from Ethan. Look at the date. Michael leaned closer. April 22nd. The day before the stock purchase. Read what he wrote, Grace pointed to the message. Richard came closer, reading over her shoulder. Michael, please prepare the final report on MedPharma. The merger will be announced tomorrow, and we need to move fast. Grace is in Moscow, so you'll have to handle the documentation. Ethan. He knew, Grace whispered. He knew the merger would be announced the next day, a full day before it became public. That's direct proof of insider trading. And he wrote himself that you were in Moscow, Michael added excitedly. That's your alibi. Richard took the printed email, studying the header. Do you still have the original file? Yes, somewhere on my old laptop, Michael said, rummaging through boxes. Hold on. He pulled out an old computer, turned it on, and waited for it to boot. There, Michael said, opening the email archive. It's all here, dates, timestamps, original headers. This can be used as evidence, Richard said, taking a photo of the screen. But it's not enough. We need banking documents proving the money went through Ethan's accounts. How do we get those? Grace asked. The banks will never give us access to the Ross family accounts. They won't, Richard agreed. But I'm sure they've kept copies, in a home or office safe. People like that always keep insurance. You're suggesting we break in? Grace stared at him, stunned. Not break in, Richard smirked. Just pay a visit. Legally. How? Richard grabbed his phone and pulled up a society column. Look. 2 weeks from now, the Ross family is hosting a charity gala at their Long Island estate. The entire New York elite will be there. So? Grace still didn't understand. So, I'll get us an invitation, Richard said, dialing a number. I have connections in those circles. And you'll come with me, as my guest. They'll recognize me. No, Richard shook his head. It's been 3 years. You've changed, your hair, your style. Add an evening gown, makeup, and a new name. Ethan Ross last saw you in a business suit and straight hair. He won't recognize you. This is insane, Grace whispered. It's our only chance, Richard said, taking her hand. While they're drinking champagne and showing off for the cameras, we'll find their office. We'll find the documents. Take photos of everything we need. And if we get caught? We won't, Richard squeezed her fingers. Because we'll be careful. And smart. Grace, this is our shot, maybe our only one. Grace turned to Michael. What do you think? I think it's risky, Michael said honestly. But if you want your life back, there's no other way. The Ross family won't back down, you have to beat them at their own game. Grace closed her eyes, took a deep breath, then nodded. All right, she said firmly. Let's do it. But I'll need help. Anything you need, Richard promised. We'll do this together. Michael looked at them, at Richard holding Grace's hand, and Grace, who for the first time in 3 years looked not frightened, but determined. He smiled. Count me in, he said. Those Ross bastards ruined the career of the best analyst I ever knew. It's time they paid for it. The next 2 weeks felt like preparing for a military operation. Richard got the gala invitation easily, his billionaire status opened every door. Grace got a new look, a stunning evening gown, a sophisticated hairstyle, and lessons in how to carry herself like part of high society. During those 2 weeks, something changed between them. They spent days and nights together, planning the infiltration, studying the floor plan of the Ross estate, which Sam had obtained through his contacts. And somewhere between late-night strategy sessions, endless coffee, and quiet moments of exhaustion, the line between professional partnership and something deeper began to blur. One evening, as they sat over a table strewn with papers, their hands accidentally brushed. Grace didn't pull away. Richard looked at her, and the air grew heavy between them. Grace, he said softly. After all this, when we prove your innocence, will you stay? Stay where? She asked, not looking away. Here. In New York. With me. She was silent for a long time. I don't even know who I am anymore, she admitted finally. For 3 years I was Emily, a waitress, a ghost. Grace Mitchell, she died the day they accused her. Then become someone new, Richard said gently, taking her hand. Go back to finance. Or do something else. Just stop hiding. What if we fail? Her voice trembled. What if the Ross family is stronger than us? Then we'll run, Richard smiled. To some warm island, drink cocktails on the beach, and pretend we don't care. Grace laughed through her tears. You're serious? Absolutely, he pulled her into his arms. Grace, whatever happens, I won't leave you. I promise. She pressed against his chest, allowing herself, for the first time in years, to feel she wasn't alone. And in that moment, something broke inside her, the walls she'd built, the fear she'd lived with, the armor she'd carried. I'm scared, she whispered. So scared. I know, Richard stroked her hair. So am I. But we'll get through this. Together. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze, and in her eyes, he finally saw what he'd been waiting for all along. Trust. Richard leaned in, and their lips met, softly, carefully, as if both were afraid to break the moment. The kiss was brief, but it held everything, a promise, a hope, the beginning of something new. When they pulled away, Grace smiled, a real, unguarded smile. Now we really can't afford to lose, she said quietly. Too much is at stake. We won't lose, Richard kissed her forehead. Because we have something the Ross family doesn't. What's that? The truth. And each other. On the night of the gala, Grace stood before the mirror and barely recognized herself. A long emerald gown revealed her shoulders, her hair was styled into an elegant updo, makeup softened her features, making her look 5 years younger and nothing like the Grace Mitchell from the photos 3 years ago. You look incredible, Richard said, entering the room. He was wearing a tuxedo, and Grace couldn't take her eyes off him. So do you, she smiled. Ready, he offered his hand. Grace took a deep breath. Ready. Michael was waiting outside the estate in a car, connected to them by phone, ready to warn them if anything went wrong. The plan was simple. Richard would distract the Ross family with talk about potential investments, while Grace, under the pretext of finding the restroom, would slip upstairs to the office, find the safe, and photograph the documents. Simple. Dangerous. Their only chance. The Ross estate on Long Island was magnificent, a 3-story mansion from the 19th century, restored with flawless taste. Lights in the windows, music, laughter. Luxury cars lined the long driveway, Mercedes, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces. Richard and Grace stepped out of the car. The doorman checked their invitation and let them inside. The grand hall was filled with guests in evening gowns and tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, waiters carried trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. New York's elite at its finest. Stay close, Richard whispered, taking Grace's arm. They moved through the crowd. Richard was immediately greeted by acquaintances, businessmen he had worked with. Grace smiled, nodded, playing her part as the poised companion of a powerful billionaire. And then, across the hall, a man in his mid-50s approached them, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. Mr. Ross himself. Richard Bennett, he said warmly, extending his hand. So glad you could join our little gathering. Mr. Ross, Richard replied, shaking his hand. Thank you for the invitation. Allow me to introduce my companion, Emily Moore. Grace extended her hand, keeping her expression calm. Inside, her stomach twisted. Here he was, the man whose family had destroyed her life. Charming, Mr. Ross said, kissing her hand politely. I hope you're enjoying yourself? Very much, Grace forced a smile. It's a beautiful home. Thank you. My wife took care of all the arrangements, he gestured around. By the way, Richard, I heard you were exploring investment opportunities in the pharmaceutical sector? Possibly, Richard said smoothly. Do you have something in mind? Let's discuss it, Mr. Ross took his arm. I'll have Ethan join us, he's the expert in that area. Grace was left alone. The plan was in motion, Richard had their attention. Now it was her turn. She glanced around. The staircase to the second floor was to the right, the security at the entrance wasn't paying much attention, all guests had been screened at the door. She picked up a glass of champagne to look natural and slowly moved toward the stairs. She ascended to the second floor. The corridor was quiet, doors closed. Grace took out her phone from the clutch and opened the floor plan they had studied. Mr. Ross's office, the third door on the right. She approached and tried the handle. Locked. Damn. She pulled a hairpin from her updo. Michael had taught her how to open simple locks, just in case. Seconds stretched like hours. Finally, a click. The door opened. Grace slipped inside and quietly shut it behind her. The office was large, dark wood, leather chairs, paintings on the walls. A safe in the corner behind a portrait of what looked like an ancestor. Grace moved the portrait aside. An electronic lock, keypad entry. She took out the small device Sam had given her, a code decoder. She pressed it against the panel and activated it. The device began cycling through combinations. 1 minute. 2. Grace stood perfectly still, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could swear it echoed through the room. Finally, a soft click. The safe opened. Inside were folders, documents, flash drives. Grace began snapping photos as quickly as she could, bank statements, contracts, correspondence. She didn't know what exactly she was looking for, so she photographed everything. Bank transfers to Swiss and Liechtenstein accounts. Shell companies. Money laundering schemes. And there it was, Proof of MedPharma Plus shares purchased through a fake account under Ethan Ross's name. Got it, Grace whispered, snapping more photos. Then she froze, voices in the hallway. A man's voice, close, getting closer. Grace's pulse spiked. She quickly shut the safe, slid the portrait back, slipped the phone into her clutch. She looked around, nowhere to hide. She pressed herself flat against the wall behind the door. The door opened. A man in his early 30s walked in, athletic build, expensive suit, arrogance radiating from every movement. Ethan Ross. He didn't see her right away. He crossed to the desk, picked up a folder. Grace didn't breathe. Then Ethan turned, and his eyes locked on her. He froze. "Who are you?" he demanded sharply. "What are you doing in my father's office?" Grace forced a nervous smile, playing innocent. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, stepping forward. "I was looking for the restroom and got lost. I pushed the wrong door, I thought it was a service room." Ethan studied her, too closely, too intently. Grace felt sweat trickle down her back. "Wait," he squinted. "Have we met?" "I don't think so," Grace said, trying to keep her tone calm. "This is my first event like this. I came with Richard Bennett." "With Bennett?" Suspicion replaced curiosity in his eyes. "Strange. I usually remember his companions. But you look familiar." Grace's heart pounded. Did he recognize her? Or was he just fishing? "I just have one of those faces," she said lightly, trying to move past him. "Excuse me for intruding." But Ethan blocked her way. "Hold on," he said, his gaze narrowing. "Your eyes? I know those eyes." The floor seemed to vanish under her feet. He knew. He remembered. Everything could collapse right here. "Excuse me, I need to get back to my companion," she said quickly, trying to step around him. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Wait," his voice hardened. Oh my God. Grace Mitchell?" Time stopped. Grace stared straight into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her life, and realized there was no point pretending anymore. "Yes," she said firmly, lifting her chin. "It's me. Grace Mitchell. The woman you framed 3 years ago." Ethan's face paled, then twisted into a smug grin. "Brave," he sneered, pulling out his phone. "Or stupid. Showing up here, my father's going to love this. The fugitive walked right into our hands." "Don't be so quick to call," Grace said, pulling out her phone and showing him the screen. "Everything that was in your father's safe is already with me, the bank transfers, the shell accounts, the proof of insider trading." Ethan's face darkened. "Give it to me," he snapped, stepping closer. Too late, Grace backed toward the door. "Everything's already been sent. Copies to my people, to the media, to my attorneys. In an hour, the whole city will know the truth about the Ross family." Ethan was shaking with fury. "You're dead. My family will destroy you." "Try it," Grace said, turning toward the door. "But this time, I have proof. And allies." She ran into the corridor as Ethan lunged after her. Downstairs, chaos had already begun. Richard, realizing she'd been gone too long, had come upstairs just in time. "Grace," he called, stepping between her and the enraged Ethan. "I have everything," she gasped. "All the proof." Noise rose from below, voices, confusion. Guests were gathering at the base of the staircase, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Ross appeared in the hall, his face pale. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Father," Ethan pointed at Grace. "It's her, Grace Mitchell. She broke into your office." Mr. Ross looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw it, realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Grace walked down the staircase slowly, her head high. Richard stayed beside her, ready to shield her if needed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace said loudly, addressing the crowd, "I'm sorry for interrupting your evening. But I have information that may interest you, information about how the Ross family framed me 3 years ago to cover up their own crimes." "That's a lie!" Mr. Ross shouted. "Security!" But it was too late. Guests were already pulling out their phones, some recording, others whispering. A scandal breaking out at the Ross charity gala, it was front-page material. "I have the evidence," Grace held up her phone. "Bank records, correspondence, laundering schemes. Everything has already been sent to the authorities and the press." "She's lying!" Ethan yelled, starting down the stairs, but Richard stepped in his way. Step aside, Bennett, Ethan hissed. No, Richard replied calmly. Game over, Ross. Time to face defeat. Suddenly, uniformed officers appeared at the entrance. The police. Michael, who had been waiting outside, had called them the moment Grace signaled she had the evidence. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ethan Ross, the lead officer said, stepping forward. You are under arrest for insider trading, fraud, and evidence tampering. We have a warrant. Mr. Ross stood frozen, looking suddenly 10 years older. Ethan tried to push through the crowd, but 2 officers grabbed him by the arms. This is a mistake. Ethan shouted. We have lawyers. We have connections. But this time, connections couldn't save them, because the evidence was undeniable. Because dozens of witnesses were watching. Because the truth had finally come to light. Grace stood motionless, watching as the Ross men were handcuffed and led away. She felt the weight of 3 long years lift from her shoulders, the fear, the shame, the running. Richard wrapped his arm around her. It's over, he said quietly. You're free. Grace leaned against him and, for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to cry, tears of relief, tears of freedom. 3 months later. The Ross case had become a national sensation. The media couldn't stop covering it, insider trading, money laundering, bribes to law enforcement. Mr. Ross and his son Ethan were sentenced to 12 and 10 years in prison, respectively. Their empire collapsed, assets frozen, companies dismantled. And the name Grace Mitchell was officially cleared. Prosecutors issued a public apology, and the corrupt detective who had taken a bribe faced charges of his own. All accusations against her were dropped. Grace stood by the window of her new office, her own office, on the 8th floor of Bennett Capital Tower. Richard had offered her a partnership, and she accepted. Now the sign on the door read, Bennett and Mitchell, Investment Consulting. What are you thinking about? Richard asked, entering with 2 cups of coffee. How strange life is, Grace said, turning to him. 3 years ago, I lost everything. And now? I have more than I ever did. We have more, Richard corrected gently, wrapping his arm around her. She smiled and kissed him. Yes. We have. Outside, the autumn sun gleamed over Manhattan. The city that had once been her prison was now her home, the place where she'd found not only justice, but love. Oh, by the way, Richard said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. This just came. An official offer from Northern Alliance Investments. They want you on their board of directors. Seriously? Grace took the envelope. You're a legend now, Richard grinned. The analyst who took down the Ross family. Everyone wants to work with you. Grace opened the letter and smiled. Tempting, she admitted. But I think I'll stay. For now, this is enough. Smart decision, Richard said, kissing her temple. Because I'm not ready to let you go. I'm not going anywhere, Grace whispered, holding him close. I've been running for 3 years. That's enough. I'm staying. They stood by the window, arms wrapped around each other, looking out at the city below. 2 people who met by chance. He had asked a joking question, she had given a serious answer, and that meeting had changed everything. Michael had returned to the big leagues too. Richard brought him on as a senior advisor, and together the 3 of them worked on the city's most important deals. A team built on trust, respect, and friendship. Later that evening, when the office was quiet, Richard and Grace sat together on the couch in her office, surrounded by papers and plans for the future. You know what I've realized? Richard said, setting aside a folder. What? That sometimes one joke can change your whole life, he said with a smile. I walked into that restaurant angry, burned out, and I asked you for financial advice, not even expecting an answer. And you answered, and everything began. I shouldn't have answered, Grace laughed softly. It was reckless. But I couldn't help it. Finance is my weakness. Good thing you didn't resist, Richard leaned closer, kissing her gently. Otherwise, I'd have lost the best thing that's ever happened to me. We both would have, Grace whispered back. Thank you, for believing me. For never giving up. I never will, Richard said, holding her tight. That's a promise. And it was a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. If this story touched your heart and you'd like to help us keep creating more stories like this one, click the Super Thanks button, the little heart with a $sign below the video. Every time you do, you help us tell stories that inspire, remind people that justice exists, and that sometimes, all it takes is courage to fight for it. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Tell us in the comments, which moment moved you the most? When Richard believed Grace? When she risked everything at the gala? Or the ending, where love and justice finally won? Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss new stories about people who never give up. Leave a like if you believe that the truth always finds its way to the light, even if it takes years. And before you go, check out the story we've left here on the screen. We're sure it will make you think and inspire you not to give up, no matter how hard life gets.